Jonah and Ricky were siblings who grew up spending most of their time exploring the woods behind their house together. There was a small river not too far from their backyard that had a small bridge made out of fallen trees and branches that allowed the boys to wander for what felt like miles to them, but in reality was probably only a short hike away from their home. This fascination with the wilderness followed the two boys as they grew up, and almost every summer was spent with the two going on camping and hiking trips. Jonah was almost 3 years older than Ricky, and oddly enough had a much larger frame than his brother did. This didn't stop him, however, when the boys began going through their cave exploring phase, and he needed to squeeze himself through tight spaces. Anywhere Ricky went, Jonah somehow managed to follow, despite being much larger. And this cave and tunnel exploration phase shouldn't even really be called a phase, I suppose, as it's something that the two continued to enjoy for the rest of their lives. Although once they showed their parents the footage that they managed to shoot of their last time in a cave system a few miles away from their house, both the boys' mother and father would say that they were uncomfortable with their children doing such dangerous activities. And actually, they made Jonah and Ricky agree to stop going out on these trips altogether. Ricky and Jonah both agreed to their parents' request, but quickly decided among themselves that they would keep exploring and just not tell their parents whenever they were doing something that would freak them out. So the two continued going on these dangerous hikes into caves and small tunnels that they would hear about online, and they loved every second about it. The thrill of being in such tight, closed off spaces and having to squeeze through holes that are no wider than a large boot's length from heel to toe in order to get to a place that might have never been explored by anyone else before them was a feeling that the brothers felt like they couldn't replicate anywhere else. It was a bummer for Ricky when his brother went off to college because it meant that, unless Jonah was home visiting, he would either have to go out hiking by himself or find someone else to go out exploring with him. And as luck would have it, Ricky had made a friend that year in high school that claimed to be just as into exploring as he and his brother were, and the two actually managed to go on a few hikes that Ricky would really enjoy. There was one spot that Ricky's friend had shown him that he was particularly fond of, and told himself that he would take Jonah there the next chance that he could. And sure enough, a few weekends after visiting the cave and tunnel system for the first time, Ricky had heard from his brother, who told him that he would be home that weekend and wanted to go to the cave that Ricky had just told him about. Jonah's little brother couldn't have been happier, and by the time Jonah got home, Ricky had already gotten everything set up. He had two backpacks with water, extra flashlights, and snacks set up, and was practically waiting for his older brother to tell him that it was time to hit the road. And when the time came, the two brothers told their parents that they were going on a simple hike on a trail just a few miles away. Once they arrived, the two brothers parked their car at the end of the hiking trail that they would have to walk down that would eventually lead them to the general area of the cave. After walking down the windy dirt path, Ricky instructed his brother to veer off the trail and begin walking through the woods. Jonah listened to Ricky, and he was glad that he did. The two brothers came upon the side of a cliff face, and in the base of a large stone wall was a narrow crack in the rocks that was about 2.5 feet high and a foot or so wide. At first, Jonah didn't believe that this was a cave entrance, but Ricky assured him that once you got inside, some of the rooms in the tunnel system were actually quite large. He could tell his brother was a bit hesitant, but who wouldn't be? So Ricky decided to lead the way and slowly squeezed his way through the crack in the cliff, and just as he told his brother, it opened up almost immediately. Once he was through, he asked Jonah to pass him their backpacks, and he told his brother to come on through. Jonah squeezed his way in through the entrance of the tunnel system, and he would have had a much harder time than Ricky did due to his size. But once he was in, and his flashlight was turned on, he could only begin to imagine what the rest of the cave system would look like. After the two brothers double-checked that they had everything that they would need, they took a sip of their water, secured their flashlights to their heads, and began making their way through the intricate tunnel system that had remained, for the most part, unexplored. The boys managed to squeeze themselves through narrow passes and cracks that allowed them to get from chamber to chamber in the cave system. They would have passed through two large rooms by the time they had reached a point that they had to make a decision. You see, in order to get into the next chamber from where they were, the two would have to lift themselves up into a small tunnel that they could leverage themselves up into, and then crawl through to the next room. The big issue was that there was very little space to squeeze through, so they wouldn't have any way to bring their packs with them. It would seem that Ricky and Jonah were confident in their ability to keep exploring without their backpacks and supplies, and they both decided to press on through. Hours had passed back home, and Ricky and Jonah's parents still hadn't heard from them, which was odd because they had promised them that they would be home before dark. Their mother was worried and began reaching out to a few of Jonah's friends that they knew would go out on hikes with them from time to time to see if anybody had heard from them. But according to everyone who answered their phones, the boys hadn't been heard from at all that day. Their mother and father grew more and more concerned as time went on, and by the next morning, when there was still no sign of their children, Ricky's mother and father called the police and reported their two sons missing. The brothers' parents contacted their phone company and managed to get a last known location based on where Jonah's phone had last had service. The location brought a search party to the forest that the trail was located on, that the boys had been walking down before heading into the cliff. And it wasn't long before the entrance to the tunnel system was found, and it was determined that the two brothers had likely gone inside. Most of the people involved in the search party were not entirely comfortable squeezing into the narrow entrance of the cave and then continuing to go deeper, and when it came down to it, only 3 people volunteered to go inside. All 3 of them claimed to have explored tunnels like these before, and wanted to do everything that they could to help the family. It wasn't long after that the 3 people began delving deeper into the darkness of the tunnels and squeezing their way through the same narrow passageways that Jonah and Ricky had the previous day. The rescue team quickly hit a snag, however, after entering the first chamber after the entrance. After slowly making their way into the chamber, the first person through would have noticed at least 4 different tunnels branching off from the chamber, each being a different size. After discussing it, the 3 volunteers decided that they would try the largest tunnel after considering Jonah's size. They figured it would be the one that he was most comfortable going through. Sadly, they weren't correct, and after about 3 hours of searching, the party made their way back to the surface empty-handed. 2 more attempts were made to find the boys, but sadly, none of them were successful. After a month, the boys were considered deceased, and a funeral service was held for Jonah and Ricky. About 2 years later, a group of hikers made up of college students from the community college nearby had heard about the story of the boys and decided that they wanted to explore the cave system for themselves. This was something that became common ever since the story broke about the location of the cave system. It became such a common occurrence that the entrance had actually been fenced off with no trespassing signs placed all over the place. This didn't deter anyone who was willing to climb over the fence, however, since there was no actual security there to stop them, and when this group of students had heard about the caves, they wanted to see just how tight some of the passageways were for themselves. The group made their way to the trail and then off the path toward the entrance at the base of the cliff, and before long they were staring down an 11-foot tall fence. It didn't take much time for the students to scale the fence and begin discussing who was going to be entering the cave system first. Much like anyone else who had dared to make their way down through the narrow crevices and tunnels, the students were all in awe of the size of the massive chambers compared to the tight spaces that they had to squeeze through to get into them. Once the group had reached the first major chamber, they stopped for a moment to take a look at the room and also began examining the tunnels leading off the chamber. Much like the rescue team, the students would have been faced with 4 tunnels to choose from, each one being a different size. Now, unlike the rescue team, who went down the largest chamber, the group was feeling particularly courageous and opted to go down the second smallest tunnel. This required them all to crawl on their stomachs through a small passage that was about 3 feet around for about 45 feet before finally reaching another large opening. The next chamber only had one path to choose from, and the group was thankful that they would be able to walk through this one. It was just a bit thin, so they would have to shimmy sideways. The first one to make it through into the next chamber screamed after shining his light toward the wall of the 8-foot-tall stone room. Against the chamber's wall sat 2 backpacks, and right away they knew that they had found evidence of the 2 boys that had gone missing in the cave system 2 years prior. Instead of heading right back out of the cave, though, the group realized that the 2 boys would have gone upward through the tunnel above them in hopes of finding the next chamber, and the students decided to continue exploring. One by one, the 4 students leveraged their way up into the small passageway and crawled through the tightest tunnel they had so far until they managed to pull themselves out and into what would be the last chamber that they could reach. You see, once again, there was only one tunnel leading out of this chamber, and as the group tried to make their way through it, they were stopped by something out of a horror film. Wedged in the narrow crevice was the body of Jonah, who must have gotten stuck as he tried to force his way into the next chamber. The group couldn't get past the body that was mostly decomposed by that point, but they could use their lights to see through to the other side of Jonah, which was the entrance to the next chamber. And right on the other side of the entrance was the body of Jonah's younger brother, Ricky. It was at that point that the students slowly and calmly made their way back to the surface and notified the authorities about what they had found. Ricky and Jonah's parents were both relieved and tormented by the news after receiving the call from the police that their children's bodies had been found. They were relieved to have closure and know that their boys were resting peacefully next to each other, but absolutely dreaded the news that they would never hear from their children again. It's believed that when they were making their way through that last tunnel, Ricky had gone first and managed to squeeze through to the chamber on the other side, but when Jonah tried, he got wedged in. The boys would have tried to get him out with all of their might, but it would seem that the space was far too narrow, and Jonah had wedged himself far too good. And with Jonah blocking the only exit, his little brother was trapped in there as well on the other side. Neither of them had their backpacks or water to keep them hydrated, and odds are their lights would have run out of battery after about an hour or two more, leaving them to die in complete and total darkness.